The sledgehammer struck, and Samantha stood frozen as her family's stone archway crumbled before her. The HOA had acted without warning, but that wasn't the worst part. What came next would change everything, and leave even the most powerful in shock. Let's start from the beginning. Samantha Parker had always believed that her family's stone archway was more than just a structure. It was a symbol. Standing tall at the entrance of her historic property in Westford, the archway was a living testament to over a century of memories. It had been there when her great-grandparents moved in, a silent witness to countless family gatherings, anniversaries, and quiet moments of reflection. The arch was a mark of history, a part of her home's soul. But one morning, that soul was shattered. She awoke to the sound of machines outside. The familiar hum of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by the heavy clanging of construction equipment. Rushing to the window, Samantha's heart sank. The archway, the proud feature that had greeted her every day since childhood, was no more. What was once a sturdy, graceful symbol of her family's past now lay in jagged pieces across the yard. Rubble, debris, a painful void where memories once stood. It wasn't just an old stone archway to Samantha. It was her heritage, her family's legacy etched in every crack and crevice. And now, it was gone, reduced to nothing more than shattered stone. The HOA, in their unyielding adherence to neighborhood guidelines, had demolished it without warning or explanation. According to them, the archway violated some obscure rule about uniformity and aesthetic integrity. But to Samantha, those words meant nothing. They hadn't seen the significance behind the stones, the generations of history embedded within them. They hadn't understood what the archway truly meant. Standing in the wreckage, she was consumed by a mix of disbelief and anger. How could they do this? How could anyone, especially the HOA, erase something so personal without a second thought? But that was just the beginning. The real question was, what would happen next? The destruction of the archway wasn't just a violation of rules. It was a declaration of war on her family's history, and Samantha Parker was determined to make them pay for it. The anger that had first simmered in Samantha began to boil over until it consumed her every thought. Each day, as she walked past the remnants of the archway, a deep, gnawing bitterness took root. It wasn't just the destruction of a stone structure. It was the destruction of everything she held dear. Her heritage, her family's story. All of it was casually dismissed by the faceless members of the HOA, who saw only a rule book, not a history. The meetings only made it worse. The self-important president, Carl Edwards, sat at the head of the table with an air of smug indifference. He spoke in corporate jargon, his words like a shield against any real emotion. Every time Samantha spoke, voicing her pain, her disbelief, he waved it off as though it were a minor inconvenience. "It's just a piece of old stone," Carl would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "No one will care once it's gone." But Samantha cared. She cared deeply. The archway wasn't just a decorative feature. It was a part of her family's identity, something that connected her to the past in ways these people could never understand. To them, it was just an obstacle to be removed, another thing to maintain uniformity within the neighborhood. They spoke of aesthetic standards like they were the laws of nature, as if their arbitrary rules could ever outweigh the importance of memory, of legacy. She couldn't let go of the hurt. It wasn't just the loss of the archway, it was the blatant disregard for everything it represented. They didn't care about history, sentiment, or the people who lived in the homes they were trying to control. They cared about power, about imposing their will on a community, regardless of the consequences. Samantha felt her resentment grow with every meeting, every dismissive comment, until it had become a sharp, bitter hatred. This wasn't just about an old archway anymore. This was about standing up to a group of people who thought they could erase the things that mattered most to her, and Samantha wasn't about to let them get away with it. Fueled by a fire that refused to be extinguished, Samantha knew the fight had only just begun. The destruction of her family's legacy wasn't something she could let go. She would make them answer for it. Enlisting the help of Julian Harris, a lawyer who understood the depth of her cause, she took her case to court. Julian wasn't just fighting for an archway. He was fighting for the right to preserve history, for the principle that a group of corporate bullies couldn't erase the foundation of a person's home and identity. The legal battle was brutal, the HOA seeing their power threatened threw everything they had at Samantha. They didn't just attack the archway, they attacked her very attachment to it. Their defense was cold, methodical. They called it a dangerous structure, a safety hazard, and claimed it was not up to code. To them, it was just another inconvenience, another rule to enforce. They argued that her emotional connection to the archway didn't matter, but for Samantha, it was everything. They couldn't understand what it meant to live somewhere where every corner, every stone had a memory tied to it. The fight had become personal. Every day felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. The opposition was relentless, throwing legal jargon and corporate strategies at her, trying to wear her down. The hours in court, the documents to sift through, the dismissive attitudes from the HOA's representatives, it all took its toll. Yet, with every attempt to undermine her, Samantha only grew stronger. This was no longer just about a piece of stone. This was about her right to live without fear, her right to exist in her own home, surrounded by the things that had always defined her. One evening, as she sat in her living room, staring at the empty space where the archway had once stood, the silence felt oppressive. The weight of everything she had lost hung heavy in the air, but in that moment, a sense of clarity settled over her. She made a vow to herself, a promise that burned within her. I will not let them get away with this. Their arrogance, their disregard for history would not go unpunished. Samantha wasn't just fighting for the archway anymore. She was fighting for something far bigger, and she would make sure they paid for what they had done. The day of the verdict arrived, and the air in the courtroom felt thick with tension. Samantha sat in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart racing as if it were trying to break free from her chest. The hours of arguments, the legal jargon, the back and forth, it all led to this moment. The judge listened with meticulous attention to every point, and when he finally spoke, the room fell silent. His words echoed in the courtroom like a hammer strike. The court rules in favor of Samantha Parker. The HOA, the very institution that had stripped away her heritage, was ordered to restore the archway. Not only that, but they were to do so at their own expense, within 6 months. The judge's decision wasn't just a legal victory. It was a powerful affirmation that no one, no matter how powerful, could trample over someone's history and dignity without consequence. For a moment, Samantha could hardly believe it. She had spent so long fighting, so many sleepless nights consumed with anger and frustration. But now, the people who had torn apart her past, who had stolen something irreplaceable, were legally bound to make it right. It felt like the weight of months of rage and resentment were suddenly lifted off her shoulders, replaced by a rush of satisfaction so pure it almost took her breath away. She left the courthouse with a calmness she hadn't known in months. Outside, the sunlight seemed brighter, warmer, as if the world had shifted on its axis. For the first time in what felt like forever, a smile tugged at the corners of Samantha's mouth. The battle had been long and painful, but it was over. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of faceless institutions. Her stone archway, the symbol of her family's history and pride, would stand tall once more. The HOA had been forced to face the consequences of their arrogance, and Samantha Parker had won.